Fantastic. I'm super excited to be on another episode of the Inside Frontier podcast. This time I'm with Sean Albertson. Sean is a legend in the CX space, and he's led teams at T-Mobile, Charles Schwab, and various amazing companies, leading customer experience, call center operations, customer experience analytics. He's done it all. And so I'm super excited to have you here, Sean, and welcome to the pod.
Absolutely, Woden. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to chat, catch up. I know we were just talking about we've seen each other at these conferences and gotten to know each other, but great to also be able to join you on this podcast. Yeah.
Fantastic. Welcome. So you've done amazing work in the CX space over the years, and now you're doing your own company, and you just launched a new book. Tell us about the inspiration around the Rocks label.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I as you mentioned, I did a lot of things over my career. Contact centers. I started on the phones back in the 1900s. Crazy that you can say that, right? And I worked through marketing and product and pricing. I did IT roles and digital roles. Everything that impacts the customer experience in one form, and a lot of analysis and analytics around CX. And what we always found was that, I think of the customer's journey like a river. And, we like to think we've created a nice, smooth, straight flow. That's not what they experience, right? They're hitting class 5 rapids. They're hitting all sorts of problems. They're bouncing from channel to channel. And that's really where this Rocks, kind of my Rocks concepts came from. Yeah. Because if we think about that, what we're understanding is our customers, when they face those rocks, those obstacles, those high effort situations, those are the tests in which they're either going to be loyal or disloyal, because effort is the most predictive, action you can look at around that. So what I do is I help companies and other practitioners find the rocks in the customer's journey and the customer's experience, because we know if we make those improvements, if we fix those, it really drives their loyalty long term. That's where my company is CX for Rocks, but my community that I just started is CX on the Rocks. That's a little bit of a dual purpose too, because I think CX practitioners, a lot of us will admit right now, our careers, our business, our work is kind of on the rocks a little bit rough waters for us. And so we're really working to navigate that together. And it's part of my On the Rocks series, of which my newest book, Alignment on the Rocks, which was launched last week, really talks about that as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, happy to dive more into the book later on. One thing that caught my eye on your profile was, what you said about companies. The biggest issue is not really around effort. Everybody's making the effort, but alignment. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So, doing it in the corporate world for 25 plus years, when companies struggled, especially when they struggled on behalf of their customers, it didn't have anything to do with how hard they were working. It didn't have anything to do with, in most cases, how many resources they had working on it. It was all about the lack of alignment in that context, because organizations are complex like people, and you've got these layers upon layers of things that you're trying to understand and do and work on together, and when alignment isn't there, that's when everything struggles. It's silos between departments that aren't aligned. It's leadership that isn't aligned. Their strategy is not aligned with reality on the front lines, or the mission, vision, and value that the company works so hard to create isn't aligned with what the customers actually need. It's all around that lack of alignment. And I translate even further that into that's a key for us as leaders, as workers, as people. We have to be aligned as well across the different dimensions of our business. So that's really where Alignment on the Rocks came from, my brand new book. And it's really walked people through frameworks of how do you understand the complexity of what your experiences are and what you're dealing with. How do you make that into real actions and opportunities to make the kind of improvements you want to make, because it's really hard, because you're so much you could do. It's kind of that boil the ocean.
Yeah.
You have to have a framework and process to really drill in on what the right things are for the organization, what they are for you and your team, and for you individually as well.
Yeah. Now, you keep saying that this rocks, concepts, it leads to a lot of opportunities. And so we're actually, the topic for this session is from rocky to remarkable, turning pain points, CX pain points into growth opportunities. Where do you see, how did you start to see the opportunity in this rocks concept leading to growth, for companies? I'm sure you had some experiences that made you see hey, this is actually where innovation starts. So this is where you can actually transform the customer experience. So where did that come from? Where did that start from?
Yeah, well, again, just like you think about the river, and I talk about this in the book, the rocks don't block the river, but they do define its direction. And so as we think a step back, if you weren't experiencing challenges, you wouldn't have an opportunity to actually excel in many cases. And it's long held true. I remember this from earlier days when I was running the contact centers. If someone called in and had an issue and you studied their experience, but they were resolved and they were, it was a great experience to create that resolution, they actually came out of that interaction more loyal than if the issue hadn't happened at all, which it seems crazy to think. Again, the statistics are real. If someone says something is hard to do, they're 13 times more likely to be disloyal. If something's easy, they're 12 times more likely to be loyal. So again, it all comes down to that effort. But when you think about it, the rock they hit, it isn't an overall class 5. One rock isn't a class 5 rapid, but it gives you that opportunity that even when your customer hits the rocks, to excel at recovery, make the resolution of that so easy that now they're even more loyal than if they hadn't had the issue at all. And that is it is such a huge, and now that's in the customer context. There's personal context and even organizational context to that as well. But we often think about, especially in the contact center or in customer experience, we're fire drill. They're fire drills all the time because we're very reactive in what's going on. But we have to change the mindset. We have to really understand that each of those potential challenges are opportunities to excel. That's a shift. And when organizations can really rally around that shift, and when people can kind of embrace that opportunity, we stop dwelling on the rock as a negative, and we start looking at that rock as the opportunity. I call it from obstacle to opportunity, where you stop really focusing on the negative context of, oh, this was bad, but focus on, this is the opportunity now to recover and excel in that context as well.
It's a very powerful framework. Very powerful. Just thinking about our product, when customers complain or have issues, it's usually a sign that they like the product. There's something they've seen that they're really interested in, and you want to pay attention to those people who are verbal enough to complain or have issues or feedback. And so I think that's great insight there around hey, that's what you should be paying attention to, where the friction is, where those opportunities could be lying. So when you spot this opportunity, right, or pain point, customer pain point, what's your first step in turning it into an opportunity? How do you take it from, hey, this is customer friction, to this is a growth opportunity?
Yeah, well, one, you have to really understand it. And I talk about it in my framework. It's kind of the FIND framework in the book, but you really have to focus. You focus in and understand what is happening. You can't do anything if you don't understand, right? You can't come out the other end in a positive way if you don't understand what's actually going on. And you have to look holistically at that experience and understand what is happening and how is it driving, that overall experience. So focus is key. You got to then identify. You've got to really understand it. Say, I focus within a certain area. I understand that, and now I have to identify, what is it I'm seeing here? What's the actual pain point? What's actually happening? And that's the identify part. Then you go in the N for find is you navigate, because not everything is above the surface of the water. You also have to look around it. What's the root cause? I have to navigate through that and understand what's really happening below the water, what's happening behind the scenes potentially that caused that pain point. And then ultimately you're focusing on really delivering solutions and looking for the future opportunity. So as you think about that the opportunity is, you have to come out of that with, I need to understand what the customer was trying to do. First off, what were they trying to do? Not what was the task they did, but what were they trying to do? What was their experience? What were the impacts of that experience? What drove that challenge? And then ultimately you have to come back around and look at designing that next solution, that opportunity, to resolve. So this is one of those things, and that's not super easy. And in real time, it's really hard. But we're looking for people who can just think beyond that, to say, to don't make assumptions. Again, I'm going a little contact center related. Don't just make assumptions on what the the customer says. You really have to spend the time, understand it, and then be able to move forward and be able to look for a solution that's going to be better than in the beginning. You can add to that, hey, if they were calling about this, not only am I going to fix their issue, but I'm going to actually make a suggestion that's going to make things easier next time, or provide those solutions. This is really where customer experience CX teams, though, can have that power, especially in the new day and age with AI. It's understanding and analyzing across all of the experiences, through text analytics, through journey analytics, through all of these research parameters we now have through AI to look at and understand. It's to bring that together at scale now and allow the organization to understand those priorities, to understand where those opportunities are to to improve, and how to best do that as a collective organization. That's where the power is. And so as we're seeing, unfortunately, CX teams in many cases being laid off, that's the exact wrong thing that's going on right now, because that's where organizations are going to miss the boat. They're going to end up sliding back further from that perspective. So it's part of where I'm championing this, across those and in this space, to drive that kind of connection and community, to to help each other and help the organizations we work for.
Yeah, that's incredible insights. In terms of making this happen, so yeah, you have this framework for identifying those pain points and transforming them into growth opportunities. Do you have some examples or stories where you've put this to work, and maybe the team was actually was really surprised at the outcome that you got out of that process?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a couple. I'll talk one, because I was working with an organization, and their digital team was really investing heavily in the in the online processes and online platforms. They're digitizing and trying to drive change, because the assumption was, hey, if we put it online, it's going to be easier, right? Great intent, great reason behind what they were doing. Kind of missed the mark on how they were doing it, because just like and this goes back to the alignment. Just like any of us, if we're only one cog in the wheel and we make a lot of changes, we got to understand, how are we impacting the rest of that engine, if you will. And so they went through, and the example was pretty good, because they were trying to speed things up. And so like, oh, we're going to cut the time, down from 4 days to 2 days. Everybody's going to love it. So they did that. Well, they weren't talking with their peers and the departments they were working with. They actually, and we saw this through the analytics very quickly, they actually moved it up before there was a link on this communication they did at 4 days, now 2 days, that went to a process to validate, this process. Yeah. Well, that link didn't work yet, because the other part of the company was still on the 4-day timeline. Wow. So, from that perspective. And so, in that challenge, of course, we immediately saw it, we addressed it, we moved it back. But then, in this case, the opportunity was to then create and break down the silos and say, oh, now we know, and here are these are the different groups. So now they actually created an aligned process between these organizations, these departments, to accomplish what they thought was important. So the next time they moved it to 2 days, the link worked. And and so it's an example of using a failure, even, if you will, because that was a failure. They messed it up, and it created escalations and everything else. But what came out of that, though, was now a partnership. Thinking of it now as the opportunity, a partnership, and they were able to then improve on, that item, but then several others after that, where they were like, they worked together with the same purpose and drive. And so if they hadn't really, in many cases, if they hadn't had that friction between the two departments, they might not have realized how much they needed to work together, and therefore wouldn't have had that relationship going forward. So it's just kind of an example of that, but you can kind of think of any number of those that drive the kind of impact you could see, because, it gives you a chance to look at things differently, assess it, and then understand the difference.
Yeah. That's a great segue to my next question around getting cross-functional teams to collaborate around, transforming these pain points when they identify them into, those growth opportunities. Is there like a recommended process or framework you have for, once we've identified these pain points, here's how we rally the team, here's how we connect like leadership to frontline teams, to really get the right outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of leadership workshops and culture projects with companies, because again, that's a hard part of an organization. It especially, mid-sized to larger organizations, they can be really hard to do that. And it ultimately takes everyone. So I like to say that it takes everyone to create the experience. And, when everyone is responsible for that experience, because everybody owns a part of it, it really means no one's responsible, right? If everyone's responsible, no one's really responsible.
Yeah.
Football just started. So for the football listeners, when you have two quarterbacks, you don't have one quarterback, right? That's the saying. I literally heard it on Monday Night Football. But when you take that and you look at that opportunity to understand that this is where, when we drive an understanding first, and I do that personally, and I like it better when organizations approaches through stories, through analogies, through, things that feel more than are just logical. I've worked with organizations where call listening, where we brought the executives in and they were able to listen to some of the calls and understand it. They even through that process realized, wow, if this, engineering team had done this, that wouldn't have happened at all. Because if they had designed it away, that would have actually fixed this potential risk. And what it allowed them to is to understand the context. Because if you think about it, we as humans, we don't remember statistics and stuff like that, and strategic priorities, bullet points, right? We don't remember that. We remember stories, because for millennia, that's how we passed down oral tradition, was through stories. And then we started writing, and guess what we wrote? We wrote stories. We're just ingrained in that. So being able to understand that through the storytelling, through that emotion as well, especially if you could tap into both the customer emotion within that, you can really drive that. Because the first thing you have to overcome is a realization that this isn't just, soft, squishy things. This is real. These emotions that our customers have, these emotions that our employees have, these experiences are driving, real things, and we need to understand it that way. And so the more stories we tell, the more examples we provide, it starts to break down those walls. Then you've got to have a process. I mean, fundamentally, you've got to have a process that brings different groups together that don't normally work together for the purposes of creating those greater experiences. And this is why when, I say the CX teams can really step in, and even sometimes, solution providers and vendors and, can be that catalyst as well, as to break those silos down and bring the groups together to understand, hey, going back to my river analogy, the customer's on the, running down the river. We each own different parts of the shoreline that they're touching as they go by. We better be talking to each other, because there's got to be a handoff from the website to the call center, or from, a marketing initiative to, the call center. All these different groups have to be able to align together, because the customer doesn't care if we have different departments. They care that they're experiencing rough waters when we're running between the different departments in that process.
Yeah, great insights, Sean. Now, regarding how teams, you've mentioned a number of things already on this call. You've talked about call listening, you've talked about call analytics, you've talked about, the AI tools and the transformation they can provide to businesses. Why do you think, companies aren't like adopting these tools the way they should? I mean, like at all the events that I've been to this year, there've been a plethora of tools and vendors, and everybody's like excited to see the latest technology. But when you talk to them afterwards, they're not really adopting these tools at the pace they should, right? What do you think is going on in the industry?
Well, first off, that is exactly right. And what you described is the problem. They're chasing a shiny tool. They're chasing something that's flashy that they see that they're like, oh, this is going to be great. Traditionally, transformation projects, things like that within organizations, trying to really drive changes at that level, fail at like a 70% rate. For AI, if you saw recently that article that came out by MIT, it's like 95% aren't getting what they should have out of the project. And to me, the reason is they're flipping that model. They're going after something they saw because it's shiny and cool looking, and then trying to figure out how to fit it into their business. That's when I consult with companies, that's the exact opposite process we take. Because what you need first is you need a strategy to say, where are our biggest challenges that we need to fix? And then let's strategize how we feel we can do that independent of technology. Then you come from that space to say, all right, now let's look at the kind of technology that will help us improve, that process, that flow, that work that we're trying to do to drive the change. Two things happen when you do that. One is, if you have the right strategy in place and the tech doesn't work quite right, you can quickly pivot and replace it with something else that will work better without, and it's still going to be a problem. Replacing anything is a pain these days, but at least it's in that direction. More importantly, as you're going in that direction, everybody starts to weigh in on and understand, all right, if this is the strategy and the direction that we're going, how can I fit into that strategy? How can I bring power to that as well? So it's one of the ways. And the other is by looking at the strategy. If you realize that the technology, you can't find the right kind of technology, guess what? Things are changing so fast. If it doesn't do it today, it might by tomorrow, literally, if everything's advancing so fast. So it gives you that opportunity to think further in the future. So if I'm thinking about adopting AI, I want to think about what's my use case, what's my strategy? I need to come up with the ROI, because if I initiate a shiny piece of technology and I fit it into the business, I may not see any ROI. But if I have a strategy, the strategy has the ROI and the technology helps with that, then we can actually see the kind of results that we expect to see, because it's based more on the strategy and implemented by the technology, but not the technology itself. Plus, it gives you a chance to get it in front of people first. That's inevitably one of the challenges is you launch something new and you throw it in front of employees or customers. You need to make sure they understand that strategy before they see some sort of widget. They're like, I didn't need this widget. So
absolutely. You also talked about teams or companies reducing CX investments, trimming down teams. There's this perception in the industry, which is real, right? That a lot of leaders see CX improvement as a cost center versus a growth driver, right? How do you talk to such people? What do you tell them when you meet them? Maybe like during your engagements or any other form of interaction? What do you tell them?
Well, and this is, again, executives have hard decisions to make. They're given numbers and they're said, financially, we can't, spend more than X. We need to cut costs, et cetera. And that's just reality, and it will always be the case. But when you think about the loyalty aspect we talked about, I can drive new growth without thinking about customer experience. but it's kind of that leaky bucket. But if everyone's falling out the back and isn't loyal customers, they're not returning, to buy, they're not renewing, they're not, buying more products, not spending more money, they're leaving, that's also revenue, right? And so you've got that balance of, of revenue and cost. And there's a lot of short-term decisions being made to say, yeah, it's important, but right now I gotta save money. So I'm going to let the people go that I can afford to let go because they're not actually talking to the customer or building the actual website. And that's where UX teams, user experience teams, CX teams, usually training, gets thrown in there. I mean, anybody not like literally hands-on the product and or the service of it, they're at risk. And those companies that take that short-term approach, they have to at least understand that it's a trade-off. And they will end up being, really in trouble down the line because of that decision. But it's hard to do that. The other side of it is it speaks to, in many cases, one of the challenges we have in CX is we've not done a great job collectively of really showing the ROI of what we do. Not everyone can look at their data like I've done with companies and say, hey, high effort, 13 times more likely to be loyal. That's 1,300%. That's a massive prediction of losing the customer when things are difficult to do. And the more difficult, the more complex, the more likely they are to leave. But that's real ROI, being able to show that. And so it's one of those areas that we have talked about it in CX space for decades of what's the ROI, but too often we've been caught up in all we have is a survey. All we have is net promoter score, or satisfaction, or whatever, and that's why we're getting we're getting pushed aside a little bit because you're like, well, you weren't giving me that ROI in the first place. Here's a way I like to put it. Again, the community and the collective, we're doing CX on the rocks, right? Customer experience is on the rocks. It's rough. It's rough for the customers. It's rough for us that are doing it. But I like to say CX, there's two definitions of CX. There's the noun of CX and the verb of CX. The noun of CX is a survey. It's a metric. It's a role. It's a department, potentially. It's something physical. That's what's in trouble, because in many cases that doesn't really, the impact hasn't been there for those nouns to deliver. The verb of CX, the customer's actual experience, right? Their actions, their experience is more important than ever. And I think what you find is a lot of executives, they know that latter part. They know that the experience needs to be improved, but they look at it and they say, well, we'll just try to make all the people that are supporting the customer be better, or the product developers design better products, or whatever that is. And that's one of the reasons why we have this yin and yang, or this challenge within the space of it's more important than ever, and yet we're not seeing the kind of growth in that space that we feel like we should.
Yeah. How should CX leaders think about ROI? So you're going to your leadership trying to get more investments, or you're trying to justify your current setup. How should you think about ROI in today's age?
One, you need to be able to predict. You need to really, whatever you're looking at needs to be able to predict action. One of the things when I consult CX teams that run surveys, and that's their primary objective, one is I tell them people aren't going to stop and taking surveys. It's not going to happen anymore. You cannot continue to look at that. You've got to think about the other ways you're gathering information, whether it is AI analytics against calls or transcripts or other, activity, physical activity with your product, everything else. You got to understand that that's where you've got to be able to live. Excuse me. And as we think about the, sorry, I had a cough and then I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, so we're starting to look at surveys and starting to look at AI analytics.
Yeah. So, when I first meet with someone, they're like, hey, we have here's our NPS score. Let's use an example. One of the more common that's still out there. I know there's a lot of people out there who say, oh, we hate NPS. And, here's where I answer that question. Does your NPS predict anything?
Hmm.
And that's one of the things a lot of companies don't do. They don't look at their net promoter scores and then, let's say, look 6 months later and say, all right, what's the likelihood or what's the rate at which those that were detractors have left the company, and are no longer customers. And most people, again, most CX teams, they just focus on the survey part. They don't really take that step back and say, all right, if I want on our ROI, I got to be able to show what the survey result predicts. And in my mind, and in all the analytics I do, I have almost never seen customer satisfaction predict anything. And, and customer satisfaction as a metric, you can use that if you want to aim it at an agent, like how satisfied were you with this agent, but it's not really going to predict customer behavior. And don't get me started with trying to ask a net promoter score around a transaction. Just don't do it. But what I have found, going back to that likelihood, is customer effort score is much more actionable. You can ask, for instance, that, but you got to say what, the effort question now starts to predict. So what we were able to do with the organization we work with is look at the survey results and then, and be able to predict that effort score predicted net promoter score, which predicted actual loyal behavior. And it all tied together. And so if you're not looking for that bigger picture, that bigger opportunity to predict behavior, you're going to miss out, because that's where the ROI is. You can look at ROI around things like, hey, we did a process and we improved upon it and it reduced time to resolution by X. That's a pretty physical improvement, but did that improvement, that reduction of time, actually improve the experience so they'll be more loyal? You can't just stop at those individual. You have to think more globally around those experiences and drive how they're driving loyalty, because within experience, that's the biggest area of opportunity we have to influence is loyalty.
Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to dive deeper on that topic with you later on. Now, just to close things out, what would you say to a company or a team or a leader who's starting his journey to actually start to pay attention to the signals coming from customers, identifying those rocks, and then transforming that into growth opportunities? What would you say to such a person?
Well, one, I'd say buy my book. No, I'm just kidding. What I'd say is it's not the easy road. It is absolutely not the easy road. If you're leading an organization or leading within an organization and you're responsible for driving improvements to experience, it is a Sisyphean task. Sisyphus, the guy had to roll the rock up and it would roll down and have to roll it up again. That's what we're doing. That's what we signed up for. It's that constant evolution. It's Groundhog Day, if you will. And it's not easy. And it takes, dedication. Just like though in the contact centers, the CX teams, et cetera, and leaders in the organization, you have to have a vision and a focus on the future, because it is too easy to get locked down into firefighting and reactive activities. Even in when you think you're talking about for the future, it still ends up being you're still reacting to the current. So one of the things that, again, I work with organizations and new leaders is to help them, think through at a deeper level in many cases, the vision and values of their organization and what they deliver to the customers. Because if you don't understand what you're really delivering to them, you won't know where you need to take it. And so being able to work through those exercises, understand the influences, within the organization of experience, et cetera, that starts to then allow them to have a more intelligent conversation with the executives, with the finance team, who's going to hopefully open up their pocket and let them spend some money. That's where we start to have that. And so I look for those leaders with that challenging role that start having those hard conversations. Start having the hard conversations about, are we surveying and for survey's sake, or are we getting value out of it? Or how are we analyzing using other methods? Because surveys aren't going to last. They're already, response rates are dismal right now, across all industries. And so that we got to really understand that they have to be thinking towards the future. And again, one of the ways we do that, we help new leaders and leaders within those teams in the CX on the Rocks community at www.cxontherocks.com. We help them understand that, because it's part culture, it's part, process like journey mapping, it's part surveys and analytics and technology. There's so many factors that come into creating great experiences. You got to do it in community at a certain level as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sean. This was amazing. I'd like to close out on the note of your book. And so you've launched your second book. What's the big takeaway you want people, anyone who reads your book, to walk away with?
Yeah. Well, and so I talked a little bit about it. So the book Alignment on the Rocks, it's reconnect the work you do with the impact you make. It's aimed for organizations to really, really understand, and individuals, the links in their own alignment or lack thereof within their business, their teams, themselves. And the intent of that understanding is to come out stronger, more aligned, and therefore in a more positive direction. And so it's kind of part self-help and part business book. It's a lot business book, but there's a little bit of that other in there, because again, it's that opportunity for folks to, really understand that most of the challenges that we're facing, are caused by, in many cases, by lack of alignment. And what we're seeing within that space is, we address certain like superfluous items, and think that we're fixing things. We're just doing it on the surface. Alignment is where you start to really change that. And so it's a passion of mine. And I'm so happy that my new book has been well received. It went live on the September 3rd, but pick up a copy out there. I ask everybody listening. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Congrats again on the book. Such a privilege to read through the review before it came out, and we'll be getting some copies for some of our customers so that they can continue to elevate their CX.
Awesome. That was great. Thanks you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, Adun. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Right. 1 second.